"Move it, Fossil! You're in our lot now!" The young man's voice rang out across the sun-baked asphalt like a shot. His palm slammed into the veteran's shoulder, hard enough to rock him back against the red 1969 Mustang. The car door clicked as it took the weight. The old man grunted, not from pain, but from the memory of being touched without permission. Around him, 3 more men closed in. Leather vests, chain wallets, camera phones already out. One walked straight to the driver's side panel and carved a long, grinding line down the paint with a house key, laughing as he did it. "Let's give her some battle scars. Make her match the driver." Another leaned in and spit across the windshield. The glob hit the glass with a wet smack and slid slowly down. The veteran said nothing. He stood still, one hand hovering near his waist, fingers trembling faintly. A blue and black tattoo, nearly washed away by decades of sun and sweat, curled just beneath the sleeve of his jacket. Recon patch, United States Army. The details didn't matter to them. "You even drive this, old man? Or just polish it like a shrine?" The ringleader took a selfie, flipping the bird in front of the scratched car. In the far lot, a truck cab rattled to life. Another air brake hissed. The veteran's eyes didn't rise. He didn't plead. He looked only at the car, or maybe through it. Something in him had gone still, like a fuse burned too low to flash anymore. But 50 yards back, a pair of hands dropped from a steering wheel. The creak of a door echoed across the truck stop. Someone else was watching. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The wind shifted slightly as the last scrape of metal faded from the side of the Mustang. Dust caught in the breeze and curled across the pavement, sweeping along the curve of the lot and brushing against the boots of a man who hadn't spoken since the incident began. He bent slowly, knees creaking with age and effort, to pick up a small leather wallet that had been slapped from his hand and now lay face down near the front tire. His movements were deliberate, not hesitant, the kind of careful that came from knowing exactly how far your body could bend before it fought back. As he straightened, a faded military dog tag on a short chain glinted briefly under the collar of his shirt, before disappearing again with a slight tug of fabric. His name was James McBride, 82 years old. He had once served as a staff sergeant in the United States Army, Armored Reconnaissance Division. The long line of medals and commendations that bore his name were boxed somewhere in the attic of a house he no longer visited. His wife, Lena, had passed 10 years earlier, and since then he had taken this drive once a year, along the same highway, stopping at the same places, eating the same simple meals. It wasn't nostalgia. It was memory maintenance, a ritual to keep his mind ordered, his grief steady, and his promise to her quietly honored. The Mustang wasn't just a car. It was part of the memory. They had bought it in 1971, back when the ink on his discharge papers was barely dry. Lena had chosen the color, cherry red with a black stripe. She said it looked like something that refused to fade. James kept it running, not as a collector would, but as a man keeping a friend alive. He knew every cough in the engine, every click in the rear suspension. When one of the young punks had kicked the mirror off just minutes earlier, James hadn't winced for his own pride. He had winced as if someone had taken a swing at her. Now, he stood by the car's front bumper, slowly tucking the wallet back into his pocket. The leather was scuffed, dark with years of fingerprints and dashboard heat. Inside were 2 folded photos, one of Lena on their porch, and one of a group of uniformed men sitting on sandbags, squinting against a blinding sun. James didn't look at the photos today. He didn't need to. Their corners were burned into his mind like boot tread in desert dirt. The gang hadn't left. They lingered by the diner, tossing pebbles into the bushes and pacing, their energy still sharp. One leaned on the hood of a rusted pickup, lighting a cigarette with a casual snap. The others laughed over something on one of their phones. A few feet away, James stood like an out-of-place statue. He adjusted his jacket sleeve, covering the edges of his old recon tattoo. The skin beneath the ink had aged, but the discipline that lived in his bones had not. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge them. He simply reached for the cloth handkerchief in his coat pocket, unfolded it with exact creases, and began gently wiping the long scratch down the driver's side door. Inside the cafe, the air conditioning rattled as it struggled to cool the long dining room. The waitress behind the counter watched James through the window, her eyes flicking between the car and the group outside. She didn't move. She stirred cream into a coffee cup and set it down in front of a half-asleep trucker who hadn't looked up from his eggs. No one inside said anything. The scene outside was easy to ignore when it was filtered through double-pane glass and the familiar hum of sports radio on low volume. James didn't ask for help. He never had. Not in Korea, not in Kuwait, not in the worst years of losing Lena piece by piece. His help came from discipline, from order, from doing the next right thing in the face of whatever storm rose up. So he kept wiping, slowly, not because he believed he could fix the damage, but because the motion was his alone, a line between what he could control and what he could endure. In his mind, he recalled another moment of wiping dirt from a metal surface. Not a car, but a rifle casing under a tarp, in the rain, back in the mountains. The feeling was the same. Clean what you can. Keep your hands busy until the danger passes. From the corner of his eye, James saw one of the young men flick a cigarette toward the Mustang. The ember scattered across the pavement and rolled to a stop by the front tire. James didn't flinch. He folded the handkerchief back into quarters and slid it into his coat pocket like a man finishing a prayer. A horn blared in the distance, sharp, not close, but enough to cause one of the gang members to glance toward the diesel lane of the stop. The moment passed quickly. They resumed their posturing. But somewhere behind the long line of parked rigs, a second engine grumbled to life. James reached into his coat, pulled out a silver watch with a cracked face, and checked the time. 6:17 p.m. He nodded slightly as if that number meant something to him. Perhaps it did. The ritual was always timed. Same highway, same exit, same coffee, black with no sugar. He stood still for a breath, then slowly eased down onto the bench near the Mustang's passenger door. The ache in his knees whispered loud, but James made no sound. The seat of the bench creaked, his eyes fixed forward. Today, something would be different. The air inside the rest stop cafe felt heavy, not from heat, but from the layered presence of people trying not to notice what they had seen. The television above the coffee bar buzzed faintly with the sound of a local baseball game, the volume turned low enough to be ignored. A neon "open" sign flickered softly in the window, throwing red light across the linoleum floor. James McBride pushed the door open with his shoulder, the little bell above the frame jangling a note too small for what he carried inside. He walked with a measured pace, not from frailty, but from calculation. Every step accounted for. His left leg dragged ever so slightly, stiff from an injury long ago. Not a wound sustained in combat, but one earned during a collapsed bridge evacuation in a flash flood, when a civilian truck driver nearly didn't make it out. He made his way to the counter and waited, not impatiently, just present. The waitress didn't acknowledge him right away. She finished pouring 2 sweet teas for a booth of young men near the corner, laughing as one made a joke too crude to belong in a place that served pie by the slice. When she finally looked up, James nodded once. She didn't smile. "Coffee? 1 water, no sugar," he said, his voice quiet but firm, weathered like a country road too long unattended. He sat at a small 2-person booth by the window, the same one he chose every year. It gave him a direct line of sight to the Mustang. From this angle, he could still see the damage. The tail light was cracked and the side panel had dulled from the deep scratch. But he hadn't parked her out of pride. He parked her where he could see her. Watching the car was part of the ritual. She represented something, not youth, not wealth, but continuity. Lena had once said the car felt like a piece of him. James believed that, so he kept it where he could keep an eye on her, like he once kept an eye on the horizon in convoy missions. Just in case. The door jingled again. The same group of young men who had mocked him outside came in, laughing louder now, bolder in the cool comfort of a public setting. One of them slapped the doorframe on the way in like a boxer entering a ring. They sauntered past James's booth, the scent of smoke, sweat, and cologne trailing behind them like exhaust. One of them bumped the back of James's seat intentionally. Not hard, but just enough to send a clear message. "You're in our space now, too." "Old-timers still breathing?" one of them muttered under his breath. Another passed James's table and reached toward the glass of water, knocking it slightly so it spilled in a thin stream across the cheap laminate surface. The cold line of water crept toward James's hand. He didn't move it. Instead, he reached into his coat again and pulled out the same folded handkerchief he had used on the car. With a slow, practiced motion, he dabbed the edge of the table until the water disappeared into the cloth. The waitress returned with the coffee and a new glass of water. She set them down without looking at James. She didn't speak. Behind her, the group had taken a booth near the kitchen and was already joking loudly about classic cars that belong in museums. "Think he even remembers where he parked?" one asked, prompting a chorus of laughter. James took a sip of his coffee. It was hot, slightly burnt, exactly how he preferred it. The familiar bitterness scented him, a sharp flavor to match the sharp edges of the day. He looked outside again. A bird had landed on the roof of his Mustang, shifting from foot to foot before fluttering away. A streak of dust curled across the parking lot. Behind him, a chair scraped loudly as one of the gang stood and made a slow walk past James's table, pretending to look at the pie display just beside his seat. The man leaned down, close enough for James to smell the beer on his breath. "Car like that. Must have come with diapers in the glove box," he whispered. James didn't blink. His hand stayed steady on the ceramic cup. The only indication that he'd heard was the subtle tightening of his jaw, the faintest flicker in the space between endurance and restraint. He didn't look at the young man. He looked at the coffee. His pulse remained calm. A young couple at the far end of the cafe exchanged a look, but said nothing. A man in a work uniform glanced up from his sandwich and then returned to his phone. The waitress gave a nervous chuckle as if to neutralize the tension without engaging it. Everyone saw. No one spoke. James continued sipping. Each movement of the cup to his lips and back to the table was measured like ritual steps at morning reveille. This was his uniform now. Stillness in the face of disrespect. Control in the presence of chaos. He didn't need a crowd. He had resolve. And the resolve was steel. Outside, the sun had begun to dip, casting long shadows across the trucks parked beyond the cafe. From his booth, James could just make out the silhouettes of two drivers standing by a rig, talking in low voices, arms crossed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the window. No one inside had stood. Yet. The clatter of a fork dropping somewhere in the kitchen briefly interrupted the low drone of idle conversation. James remained seated, hands wrapped gently around the ceramic mug as the group of young men filtered back outside, noisier than before, emboldened by the quiet that had met their antics. The door slapped shut behind them, its little brass bell ringing out like a false note. For a moment, the cafe returned to its small-town rhythm, until a sharp, hollow sound echoed in from the parking lot, unmistakable and jarring. The solid clack of a rock striking metal. James slowly turned his head toward the window. Another rock hit the car, this one lower, somewhere near the bumper, followed by the unmistakable clang of laughter. One of the young men had gathered a handful of gravel from the edge of the lot and was casually tossing them at the Mustang like it was some battered carnival target. Each stone left a tiny dent or scuff in the pristine finish that James had spent decades maintaining with reverent care. The man on the hood laughed louder. He wasn't just touching the car. He was sitting on it now, one boot planted on the fender, the other swinging freely. He leaned back as if it were his own, posing for the other's phones, grinning wide. The afternoon sun glared off the glass, but James didn't squint. He just stood, slowly, deliberately, and pushed his chair in as he always did. A quiet ritual, unbroken even in chaos. By the time James stepped outside, the gang had surrounded the car again. They didn't yell. They didn't need to. Their presence was loud enough. James walked with purpose, his steps marked not by haste but by weight. Each movement carved from principle, not speed. He passed the cafe door without a glance inside, though several eyes followed him now. The bell had rung again when he exited, and in its fading chime was a kind of silent alarm. Something was shifting. "That car's older than you are," James called out, voice low but resonant, the authority still there beneath the gravel of age. "Get off it, now." The leader, the same one who had keyed the side earlier, stood at the front, tossing James's keys into the air like a child with a toy. He caught them with a smirk and tilted his head. "You want it so bad? Catch!" With a flick of his wrist, the keys were hurled toward James, but not within reach. They clattered to the ground with a taunting spin, landing near the rear wheel. As James bent to retrieve them, the young man raised his foot and in one swift motion kicked the side mirror clean off. It hit the pavement with a sickening crunch, fragments of glass scattering beneath the car's shadow like shattered time. James stepped forward, not with aggression, but to protect. One hand up, the other extended slightly as though shielding a child. Another member of the gang stepped in, placed both palms on James's chest, and shoved him backward. Not hard enough to knock him over, just enough to degrade. James stumbled slightly, caught himself and looked down. One of the rear tail lights was gone now. Smashed in with a tire iron one of them had retrieved from the pickup. Red shards lay scattered across the blacktop. Slowly, wordlessly, James knelt beside them. He picked each piece up with bare hands, the edges cutting faint lines into his skin. But he didn't stop. He placed the shards carefully into a cloth he kept in his coat pocket and folded it once, twice, pressing the blood into the fabric as if sealing it inside. A woman in her 60s stood frozen at the edge of the lot, one hand clutching her purse, the other pressed to her chest. She started forward, hesitated, then stepped fully into the scene. "Leave him be," she said with wavering strength. "What's wrong with you boys?" The leader turned toward her, laughing. "Mind your business, lady." One of the others mimicked a fake cough and wheezed out, "Heroes get discounts, right? What's he doing here? Looking for coupons?" Across the cafe window, the cook leaned against the counter, watching. The waitress looked away. The baseball game played on. The only ones who moved were outside, and even then, only to damage. A trucker from one of the rigs took 2 steps forward from his cab. He looked like he might say something. He raised a hand. One of the gang members saw and held up a warning finger. Not threatening, just enough. A silent dare. The trucker paused. He stepped back. The message had been received. James stood again. The cloth in his hand was stained now, the red from the tail light blending with the red from his fingers. He didn't look at his hand. He didn't look at the gang. He turned back toward the bench by the Mustang and walked the few feet back to it, never once breaking posture. The walk was slower this time, each step etched with quiet pain. He sat. He set the cloth bundle beside him like something sacred. And still, the old soldier didn't flinch. The bench beneath James groaned softly as he lowered himself onto it, not from age or weight, but as if even the wood knew what it carried. The afternoon light had changed, no longer sharp and yellow, but warmer now, edged with copper, as the sun dipped lower toward the hills beyond the highway. Dust hovered in the air around the Mustang like a quiet storm had passed, but nothing about James looked unsettled. He took a deep breath through his nose, slow and steady, like he was gathering something from the wind itself. He pulled the folded cloth from beside him and opened it carefully in his lap. Inside, the fragments of red glass shimmered like broken rubies. One by one, he began wiping them clean with the edge of his sleeve. Not to repair them. There was no illusion they could be restored, but to preserve them, as though he were tending to relics from a battlefield. His hands worked with a slowness that carried precision, not frailty. Each shard was treated with dignity, even the smallest sliver. A kind of reverence lived in the gesture, the kind only men who've lost too many brothers understand. He unfolded his coat next, laid it flat across his lap. It was simple, Brown canvas, worn smooth at the elbows, its seams faded by sun and time, but stitched carefully inside the lining was a patch. Recon, 7th Infantry Division. The edges were hand-stitched tighter than regulation. He ran his thumb along it once, like one might over a name etched in stone. Behind him, the gang had gone momentarily quiet, their voices lower now, just out of reach, yet still full of the cruel cadence of those who mistake silence for weakness. One of them lit a cigarette. Another paced near the front of the cafe, tossing James's keys in a casual rhythm. Up, down, up, down. But James sat unmoved. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a small tin. It was the kind that once held loose tobacco or mints, now dulled with age. He opened it. Inside was a scrap of an old map, folded neatly, yellowed and soft at the creases. Beneath it, a lighter, plain, steel, dented. On one side, scratched in by hand, Lena. He held it for a moment, fingers curling around it gently, then set it back and closed the tin. The Mustang's paint had been gouged, its mirror broken, its symmetry wounded. But James didn't look at it with loss. He looked at it with the kind of love men show old flags, battle-scarred and still flying. His gaze wasn't about what had been done, but about what remained. 2 children peeked from the diner window now, siblings maybe, a boy and girl. Faces pressed to the glass, fingers splayed like starfish against the surface. Their father stood behind them, his face unreadable, his body caught in that mid-posture of deciding whether to act or remain still. He chose the latter. The children just watched. James sipped his coffee. The heat was mostly gone now, but he took it in with the same pause, the same quiet steadiness. When he swallowed, his eyes closed for a second longer than necessary, and a memory passed through his mind like a breeze through an open tent. He was 22 again, somewhere north of Quang Tri. Rain so thick it fell sideways. A convoy stalled, tires half sunken in the red clay. No one speaking, just the hum of idling engines and the far-off echo of something that might have been thunder, or not. He remembered the face of the young corporal beside him, glasses fogged, fingers trembling as he rechecked his rifle's chamber. James had laid a hand on the man's shoulder, not to instruct, just to be there. That was all. And sometimes it was enough. He opened his eyes. A long-haul rig rumbled somewhere in the back lot. Its engine had started, idling low and steady, like a slow breath gathering strength. James didn't turn, but he heard it, felt it even. The keys were still being tossed behind him, but slower now. Less rhythm, less amusement. As if the air had changed and no one quite knew why. A crow landed near the Mustang, hopped twice, and took off again. James placed the cloth of glass fragments back into his coat and buttoned the top button. Then the second, then the third. Not out of cold, out of habit, out of ritual. The way men used to prepare before roll call, before reveille, before the unknown. Behind the diner's counter, the waitress had stopped moving, her eyes fixed on him, coffee pot still in hand. She said nothing, but her breath had slowed. Still no one stood. Yet. The first sign was not a movement, but the absence of one. From the far end of the parking lot, parked beneath the dull aluminum overhang where freight rigs rested like sleeping giants, one truck's engine cut abruptly. The sudden silence was almost louder than the idle thrum that came before. Its headlights dimmed, then clicked off entirely, leaving only the soft glow of amber clearance lights painting the gravel below in honeyed light. Inside the cab, high above the ground and framed by the open window, sat a man who had not touched his coffee since the gang stepped out of the cafe. He hadn't blinked often either. His eyes, slate gray and steady, had remained fixed on James from the moment he first heard metal scraping metal. Not in pity, not even in outrage, but something closer to calculation, like a soldier scanning a distant ridge for movement. One hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, the other lay across his leg, unmoving. There was a patch sewn onto the dashboard carpet, faded and threadbare. Gunner, Vietnam 72. His name was simply that now. Gunner. Maybe once it was Alan or Roy or something with syllables. But on the road, among the freight rigs and dispatch stops, all anyone knew was Gunner. His rig was a silver Peterbilt, polished enough to catch sunset, but battered enough to suggest stories it didn't tell. The mud flaps bore the outline of an eagle. The rear bumper had a sticker half-torn that read, "If you love freedom, thank a vet." The man in the passenger seat stirred, younger, wiry, face drawn with too many nights behind the wheel. He looked over. "You want me to, Gunner didn't move. His voice came low and dry. "Not yet." The man settled back. Outside, James continued his quiet vigil, back straight, hands folded in his lap. Across the lot, the group of young men had begun to drift again, tossing crushed soda cans toward the drainage ditch. One climbing into the bed of their truck. The leader still twirled James's keys in his fingers, now slower, his expression more thoughtful. A kind of unease had begun to set in. Not fear, not quite, but the unspoken realization that no one was laughing anymore. The waitress inside the cafe stepped out from behind the counter. She took one cautious step toward the door, paused, then returned to the register and turned off the radio. It was an old country station. Conway Twitty had just faded to silence. Gunner placed one gloved hand on the dash and leaned slightly forward. The light caught the side of his face. His jaw clenched. His fingers tapped once, a signal only he knew the rhythm to. Not a command, just a heartbeat. In the adjacent lot, another truck's engine coughed to life but didn't drive. It simply idled. Its lights came on. Then a third. Further down the row, beneath a line of sleeping rigs, the quiet roar of awakening began. Not in unison, not dramatic, but one by one. No horns, no alarms, just a shared understanding. Something was being noticed. Gunner reached for the small radio affixed to his dash. He didn't speak into it. He just lifted it, thumbed the side button twice, a double click, and set it back down. Inside the cafe, the father who stood behind the children moved to the door and opened it slightly. He stepped halfway out, held the door with one hand, and stared at the gathering machines. A look passed over his face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. James didn't turn around, but the wind did. It shifted suddenly like a flag turning mid-breeze and carried with it the scent of diesel and gravel and something more, the feeling of being watched, not by predators, but by guardians. The difference was subtle, but James had felt it before, in jungle tree lines, in convoy shadows, in that last long breath before an ambush or an answer. The Mustang sat between them all, James, the gang, the watchers, like a flag planted in the ground of contested space. Wounded, yes, but still whole. Gunner's door opened. Slowly. He stepped out, one boot at a time, hands empty, head high. He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He simply looked across the lot toward James, then at the young men still clustered around the car. The leader met his gaze for half a second, then looked away. And somewhere, far beyond the rest stop, a hawk cried out. The sound of James's keys being tossed stopped abruptly. They hit the dirt with a dull thud, kicked from the gang leader's hand by accident or frustration. No one reached to pick them up. The air had changed too much. Even the laughter that once echoed from the gang now died as soon as it left their throats, falling flat against the silence that had grown heavy around them like fog. The leader squinted toward the lot, trying to make out what was happening behind the curtain of idling diesel. What he saw wasn't threatening, not in the way he was used to. There were no weapons, no raised fists, just men, standing, not close, not rushing, just there. Their presence so firm it felt like concrete being poured around the moment. One of the gang members, the one in a red windbreaker with a broken zipper, shifted uncomfortably. He nudged the guy beside him. "You see that?" he muttered. The other didn't respond, only swallowed and looked away. From the other side of the lot, another truck door swung open. A tall man stepped out, backlit by the soft orange of his cab lights. His hands were in his pockets. He wore a faded cap that looked older than most of the men he faced. The patch on his chest read, Navy 78. He said nothing, but his steps were deliberate, unhurried. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he moved toward the space where the circle of truckers had begun to form. And then came the moment. Gunner stepped forward. He didn't march. He didn't rush. He simply walked, like a man who had made up his mind and had no more need for words. His path curved gently through the lot, past the other rigs, past the pumps, toward the center where James sat beside his wounded Mustang. The gang watched, unmoving. One of them whispered something, but it was lost in the hum of the idling trucks. The youngest among them, no older than 19, with a streak of bleached hair curling over his forehead, took one step backward. No one followed him. James looked up as Gunner approached. He didn't smile. He didn't rise. But something eased in his shoulders. Not relief, not dependence, just recognition. Gunner stopped 3 feet away. He bent down, not fully, just enough, and picked up the keys from the ground. He looked at them for a second in his palm. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and placed them in James's hand. No ceremony, just weight and understanding. James nodded once. Then Gunner turned, not to the gang, not to the truckers, but to the car. He walked to the front of the Mustang and stood still. His stance shifted. He lifted his hand, flat, sharp, and gave a single respectful salute. The kind of salute not for rank, but for remembrance. The lot froze. One by one, the truckers followed. No signal was given, no order passed, but they moved as if choreographed by a shared past. Across the gravel, men climbed down from their rigs. A dozen of them now, maybe more. Some in jackets bearing old patches, 101st Airborne, United States Marine Corps, United States Navy Submarine Service. Others wore nothing at all but silence and purpose. They lined the edge of the lot, not blocking, not threatening, just there. Arms folded, hands in pockets, boots still dusty from the road. Their presence was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It formed a wall more solid than any barricade. Inside the cafe, someone dropped a fork. It clattered on tile, and no one moved to pick it up. The waitress stepped out onto the porch, coffee pot still in hand. Her other hand lifted to her mouth as she watched the growing circle around James. She didn't speak, but tears had begun to gather in her eyes. The gang stood frozen in place. The leader turned his head as if measuring the weight of what he was looking at. But there was no playbook for this kind of pressure. No way to laugh it off or lean into bravado. These men weren't yelling. They weren't pushing. They were simply standing. And somehow it was enough. The young one with the bleached hair finally turned and walked away, fast. His footsteps echoed across the lot. No one stopped him, but no one followed. James reached out and ran a single finger along the edge of his Mustang's hood. The paint was still scratched, the mirror still broken, but the car, like the man, remained upright, dignified. He took a slow breath, his eyes closed, and in the stillness that followed, it became clear. This was not about revenge. It was about respect, and everyone felt it. The air didn't move for several seconds. It hung heavy, like the thick breath before a storm breaks, or the stillness just after a final bell has rung. James remained seated beside the Mustang, his keys now returned to his hand. He didn't grip them tightly, nor did he let them fall. He held them lightly, the way one holds something they've carried far too long to clutch with urgency anymore. Before him, Gunner stood like a stone post in a forgotten field. Tall, weathered, but rooted in a place only men like him could recognize. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, something passed. Not a memory, but a kind of verification, a seeing. Two paths, long divided by time and war and silence, crossed again at the feet of a battered car beneath a restless American sky. None of the truckers spoke. They didn't need to. The men who lined the edge of the gravel lot had seen things. not just in war zones or jungles or oil-slick deserts, but in hospital waiting rooms, in flag-folding ceremonies, in the thousand-yard stares of brothers who came home different. They had all, in some way, made this same stand before, just never together. Until now. The gang that once stood so tall now looked small, not just in number, but in presence. Their jackets hung looser, their words dried up. The leader no longer twirled the keys, nor kicked gravel with swagger. He simply looked down and wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to remove something that wasn't dirt. One trucker, a black man with a white beard and an old Navy destroyer patch sewn onto the sleeve of his canvas jacket, stepped forward. He didn't go far. Just enough that his boots came into the sunlight cutting through the awning. He bent down, picked up James's coffee cup, which had fallen during the scuffle, and placed it gently on the hood of the Mustang. Then he turned and walked back into the line without a word. From the corner of the cafe window, the teenager who had been filming earlier now pressed his phone tighter to his chest. He was no longer recording. He was watching, really watching. His mouth was open slightly, but no sound came. His father placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving a single squeeze. Then he did something else, something unspoken. He stood a little taller. One of the younger gang members, a Latino man with nervous eyes and a shaky laugh, shifted forward and opened his mouth as if to explain. But a trucker to the left of him, stocky and bald with a scar across his jaw, turned his head just enough to meet his eyes. There was no threat in it, but there was finality. The young man closed his mouth and stepped back without saying anything. Gunnar finally moved. He took a slow step back from James, turned, and made a quiet half-circle walk toward the center of the lot. His boots stirred the gravel gently with each step. He didn't call out, didn't raise his voice, but something about the way he walked, the way his shadow moved beside the others, signaled the completion of a vow. The rest followed. Each trucker, without ceremony, began to shift their position, not to leave, but to deepen the formation, not tighter, but stronger, like a living perimeter, built not to trap, but to protect. James turned his gaze from them back to the Mustang. He ran a hand along the scar left by the gang's key. His palm paused over it. He didn't try to fix it, didn't buff it out. He just touched it, the way you might touch a scar on your own skin, knowing that healing and damage can live in the same place without contradiction. One last moment unfolded. A younger trucker, maybe mid-30s, wiry, with sunburnt cheeks and a nervous gait, stepped forward and held out a cloth. Clean, white, folded like something sacred. James looked up at him, surprised. The man cleared his throat, barely above a whisper. "My dad served in your unit, sir. Recon, 7th Infantry. Said you'd never meet men like that again." He looked at the car, the blood on James's knuckles, the set of his jaw. Guess he was wrong. He offered the cloth again. James took it with a nod. The two men didn't shake hands. They didn't exchange names. But something settled there, like a flag finally touching down after a long descent. And from somewhere deep in the distance, a low horn sounded. Not loud, just one long note held like breath. It came from a rig far down the road, and somehow it was understood. Recognition didn't always have to arrive with applause. Sometimes it came with nothing more than the stillness of men who stood their ground, together. Gunnar did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside James, both of them now seated on the same long bench beneath the soft shadow of the cafe's wooden overhang. The Mustang rested before them, scuffed but intact, the early afternoon sun catching on the scratched chrome like silver battle scars. The truckers had stepped back, forming a quiet perimeter once more, still present but at ease, their collective gaze now drifting between the car and the men seated in front of it. The stillness between James and Gunnar felt earned, not awkward, not forced. It was the kind of silence that comes after the worst of it has passed, the kind that follows thunder but still leaves the scent of ozone in the air. Gunnar leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his thighs. His hands were large, calloused, the nails clean, but worn down by years on the road. He didn't turn his head when he spoke. "That's a 1969 fastback, ain't it?" His voice was low, the kind of voice made not for crowds but for front seats and firelight. James nodded once, his fingers still loosely holding the white cloth that had been offered to him. "Bought her in Savannah. Same month Nixon pulled the last troops." Gunnar gave a low exhale, not quite a laugh, more like a memory being dusted off. "My brother had one. Same color. But yours?" He leaned back now, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were seeing something beneath the surface of the car's skin. "Yours came out of Da Nang, didn't it?" James didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a pack of mints, unwrapped one with deliberate hands, and placed it on his tongue. The pause wasn't theatrical. It was real. A pause made by someone deciding what still mattered enough to say out loud. "She came over in pieces," he murmured. "Packed her myself. Took a year to get her road ready. Never figured I'd keep her this long." Gunnar nodded slowly, but the tilt of his head told another story. A memory deeper than the one being spoken. He squinted into the distance, past the lot, past the horizon. "We lost 4 trucks that week," he said softly. "One of them was ours. The rest were med units. I remember the chatter on the comms. Heard stories of a guy bringing a field doc and a nurse out through fire lines. No escort. 2 flat tires. One of these," he gestured toward the Mustang, "just like her." James's jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't confirm, he didn't deny. He just stared ahead. Gunnar didn't need the answer. Neither did the others. The quiet around them grew denser. The truckers who had once been scattered now inched closer, not physically, but emotionally. There was a pull in the air, a moment aligning itself. Even the wind seemed to hush. "I was there," Gunnar added after a beat, almost apologetically. "Not at the line, but at the evac point. Saw a nurse come off a flatbed with blood on her boots and tears in her blouse. She kept saying, he wouldn't turn around. He just kept driving. Thought it was a ghost story. Something made up to keep the rest of us hopeful." James shifted slightly. His eyes blinked once. Slow, then again. The only movement was the tremor in his left hand. Faint, rhythmic, and not new. A whisper came from the left side of the lot. One of the younger truckers, early 40s, still lean but already carrying the slow creak of years in his knees, murmured to no one in particular. Heard that story at a depot in Yuma. They never named the driver. Another voice from the other side, rougher, older, added, "Saw the bullet holes in the car myself. They said she wasn't going to make it back. But here she was, scratched, bent, still running, just like her owner." The gang that had once crowded James now lingered on the outskirts of the moment, unsure where to stand, unsure what to do with their eyes. The leader looked pale now, his confidence drained not by confrontation, but by the truth of legacy. He glanced at his phone but didn't lift it again. A fly buzzed near the Mustang's side mirror, circled, then flew off. James finally spoke, his voice rougher now, the kind of gravel that comes from decades of silence. The nurse's name was Eleanor. She cried the whole way, not out of fear, out of guilt. Said she hadn't saved enough. I told her we don't count what we lose when we're still trying to save what's left. Gunnar looked at him then, really looked. And in his eyes, there was no disbelief, only respect. Not the kind printed on hats or stitched into patches, the kind that's earned in the places no one ever writes about, in the space between explosions, in the hours after. The truckers stood a little straighter, and those who had mocked, they couldn't speak. The dust in the air settled as if in agreement, as if even the wind understood something sacred had just passed between the 2 men on the bench. James didn't move much, just rested his hands in his lap again, the cloth still between his fingers. But the way he sat had changed. It wasn't taller. It wasn't prouder. It was clearer, as though the weight he'd carried silently through so many states, through years and highways and silence, had finally been set down, if only for a while. Then Gunnar stood. There was no signal, no announcement, no raised voice. Just the motion of an old trucker rising from a bench, cap in hand, boots settling on warm gravel. His stance was not stiff like in parades, but solid, rooted like something grown out of the asphalt itself. He turned not to James first, but to the others, the ones who had watched, waited, witnessed. "You boys don't have to understand," he said, his voice even and firm, "but you will leave." The gang leader froze where he stood, his jaw tensed, his fists clenched just enough to betray fear behind the bravado. But no one stepped forward. No threat was made. Just eyes, a dozen sets of them, watching, tracking, holding him in place like invisible spotlights. One of the punks opened his mouth to say something, but the bald trucker with the scar across his jaw shifted slightly, and that was enough. The gang stepped back, slowly, wordlessly. They moved as one, backs turned, the sound of gravel beneath boots and worn-out sneakers replacing their earlier laughter. As they passed the edge of the cafe, the youngest of them, the one who had recorded on his phone, paused. He looked once at James, then down at the car, and without saying a word, he powered off the phone and pocketed it. The circle of truckers remained still. No one moved until the last of the gang's boots disappeared beyond the turn of the rest stop entrance. Then, slowly, the formation broke. Not abruptly, not like a crowd dispersing, but like an old flag being carefully folded. Gunnar walked toward the Mustang. He didn't ask. He simply crouched beside the car and ran his fingers gently along the cracked edge of the driver's side mirror. "She deserves better than this," he said softly. A red-headed trucker, broad-shouldered, wearing a grease-stained denim shirt, stepped forward next. He carried a weathered metal toolbox. Without ceremony, he kneeled next to Gunnar and began unscrewing what was left of the mirror's mount. "Give me 10 minutes, he said quietly. "I got a spare in the rig from a .72 Dart. It ain't exact, but it'll hold till you find the right one." Another man followed, pulling a soft cloth from his vest pocket, then began to gently wipe the dust from the hood. Not rubbing, not scrubbing, just touching with care. "We don't fix it for looks," he said aloud to no one in particular. "We fix it because we remember what it carried. One by one, more joined. No orders, no direction." A cup of clean water was placed beside James's boot. A small flag, cloth, not plastic, was quietly affixed to the antenna. Someone pulled a roll of duct tape from their pocket, tore a piece off, and began sealing the broken taillight gently, as if applying a bandage to something living. The waitress who had once looked away now emerged from the cafe with 2 fresh cups of coffee. Her apron was wrinkled, but her hands were steady. She approached James slowly and placed 1 cup beside him on the bench. "Hot. No charge," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't." Her voice trailed off, but she didn't have to finish. James met her eyes, then simply nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, but in acceptance. The kind that comes from a life already full of goodbyes and quiet reckonings. At the edge of the lot, the cafe manager stood beside a rusted aluminum sign that read, "Customer Parking Only." He reached up and unscrewed it, carefully, deliberately, then walked it over to Gunnar. "We can do better," he said, offering the sign like a folded flag. Gunnar took it, stared at it, then turned to the others. He walked past the Mustang, past the bench, past the pumps, and toward the low cement curb near the front of the lot. There, with a quiet strength that felt ceremonial, he drove the post into the dirt by hand. Then, from a cloth bag he'd carried out of his rig, he pulled a new sign. It was simple, wooden, hand-painted. Reserved, veteran parking only. No stickers, no logos, no branding, just respect. The last word spoken was Gunnar's. As he returned to the circle of truckers, his voice didn't rise, but it carried through the air like something more ancient than sound. "From now on, this stop's got a new rule. You see a veteran, you act like it." No one cheered, but every man nodded, and the American flag above the cafe fluttered with just enough wind to be heard. A week later, the sun rose the same way it always did over Route 68. Slow, wide, indifferent. The shadows of the truck stop stretched long across the gravel, and the scent of diesel and day-old coffee lingered in the crisp morning air. There was no crowd this time, no commotion, just the soft crunch of tires rolling in over familiar ground. The Mustang pulled up the same way it always had, slow and steady, humming like an old song with too many verses to forget. The new side mirror caught the morning light, glinting with a kind of quiet defiance. The hood still bore its long scratch, the scar that had not been covered, only buffed smooth. James parked in the same spot, but this time, there was a small cone beside it, painted with red and blue stripes. A wooden sign stood next to the bench, the words now lacquered and firm. Reserved, veteran parking only. He didn't look around for approval. He didn't need to. He simply stepped out of the car, cane in hand, and stretched his back with a soft breath. He moved slower than the week before, as if every bone in his body remembered that day. Not in pain, but in weight. The kind of weight that keeps a man anchored to his own truth. A teenager stood nearby, same boy who had held the phone. This time, his hands were empty. In one of them was a coffee cup, black, hot, steam curling into the air. He didn't speak, just walked it over and placed it on the bench before James could sit. He nodded once and backed away. James didn't ask who sent him. He just sat. Across the lot, the door of a blue rig creaked open. Gunner stepped down, slowly, brushing crumbs from his flannel. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He just leaned against the cab and watched, a quiet sentinel. The kind of man who understood that sometimes presence was more sacred than action. Inside the cafe, the waitress placed a folded napkin at the counter, then added a second cup to the tray without being asked. She didn't look toward the window, but she smiled just the same. Something had shifted in her. Not regret, not obligation, but remembrance. And that remembrance came with its own kind of peace. Other truckers came and went. Some waved, some nodded. One placed a small sticker on the back of the Mustang as he passed. A faded eagle, its wings stretched wide. James didn't remove it. He sat with his coffee in one hand, and the cloth from the week before folded beside him. The wind lifted the flag above just enough to catch his eye. He looked at it, not with awe, not with pride, but with memory. The bench beneath him had been worn smooth over time, but something about the way he sat now, a little straighter, a little less guarded, told a different story, a quieter one. No ceremonies, no cameras, just one man, one cup of coffee, and a Mustang that still ran. A silence stretched across the lot, the kind that wasn't empty, but full of things not said, not needed, not forgotten. And then, James McBride spoke, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, just out into the morning air. Sometimes, you stand alone long enough, and the world remembers to stand with you. The coffee cooled slowly. The light moved across the chrome of the hood, and the road ahead waited, patient like it always did, wide open and lined with the echo of old engines and even older stories. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.